Harper Audio presents George MacDonald, an anthology, 365 readings. Edited and with a preface by C.S. Lewis. Read by Julian Rhind-Tutt. Preface. All that I know of George MacDonald I have learned either from his own books or from the biography, George MacDonald and His Wife, which his son, Dr. Greville MacDonald, published in 1924. Nor have I ever, but once, talked of him to anyone who had met him. For the very few facts which I am going to mention, I am therefore entirely dependent on Dr. MacDonald. We have learned from Freud and others about those distortions in character and errors in thought which result from a man's early conflicts with his father. Far the most important thing we can know about George MacDonald is that his whole life illustrates the opposite process. An almost perfect relationship with his father was the earthly root of all his wisdom. From his own father, he said, he first learned that fatherhood must be at the core of the universe. He was thus prepared, in an unusual way, to teach that religion in which the relation of father and son is of all relations the most central. His father appears to have been a remarkable man, a man hard and tender and humorous all at once, in the old fashion of Scotch Christianity. He had had his leg cut off above the knee in the days before chloroform, refusing the customary dose of preliminary whisky, and only for one moment, when the knife first transfixed the flesh, did he turn his face away and ejaculate a faint, sibilant whiff. He had quelled, with a fantastic joke at his own expense, an ugly riot in which he was being burned in effigy. He forbade his son to touch a saddle until he had learned to ride well without one. He advised him to give over the fruitless game of poetry. He asked from him, and obtained, a promise to renounce tobacco at the age of 23. On the other hand, he objected to grouse shooting on the score of cruelty, and had in general a tenderness for animals not very usual among farmers more than 100 years ago. And his son reports that he never, as boy or man, asked him for anything without getting what he asked. Doubtless this tells us as much about the son's character as the father's, and should be taken in connection with our extract on prayer, page 104. He who seeks the Father more than anything he can give is likely to have what he asks, for he is not likely to ask amiss. The theological maxim is rooted in the experiences of the author's childhood. This is what may be called the anti-Freudian predicament in operation. George MacDonald's family, though hardly his father, were of course Calvinists. On the intellectual side, his history is largely a history of escape from the theology in which he had been brought up. Stories of such emancipation are common in the 19th century. But George MacDonald's story belongs to this familiar pattern only with a difference. In most such stories, the emancipated person, not content with repudiating the doctrines, comes also to hate the persons of his forebears and even the whole culture and way of life with which they are associated. Thus books like The Way of All Flesh come to be written. And later generations, if they do not swallow the satire wholesale as history, at least excuse the author for a one-sidedness which a man in his circumstances could hardly have been expected to avoid. Of such personal resentment I find no trace in MacDonald. It is not we who have to find extenuating circumstances for his point of view. On the contrary, it is he himself, in the very midst of his intellectual revolt.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?